everybody. Hope you're having a nice evening and it is sunny where you are. Welcome to our BCS Law Specialist Group event. I'm pleased to welcome Barbara Zapisky here. Hello there, Barbara, how are you?
Hi, Sam. I'm great. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Excellent. Well, I think unless you've had your head underneath a rock or in the sand, you probably would have heard of AI and what's been happening. There's been a lot of development recently, but one of the areas which hasn't really been covered, we think, is sort of AI governance, how sort of risks are managed and how AI can be managed effectively within an organization. And that's where Barbara comes in. So we're very pleased that you can spend some time with us this evening, Barbara, and I will leave it up to you to do your presentation. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and then Panajota, who's the Secretary of the BCS Law SG, will go through those questions and Barbara will answer them. Sorry, I should have probably introduced myself. I've assumed that everybody knows me. I'm Sam De Silva. I'm the chair of the BCS Law SG. I probably know many of the names there, so welcome again. But yeah, without further ado, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. Right. Hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you very much for setting aside an hour of your time on a what is chilly Thursday evening in the UK and discuss governance of AI with me. Now, I have an ambition to make sure that you learn at least 5 new things today. So we have a fairly busy agenda. So I will talk for around 45 minutes. And then if you have questions, we'll address questions at that point. Now, the question that I want to or the rhetorical question that I want to pose to the audience is, how do we feel about AI? AI enterprise products have been around for at least 10 years. Now, what happened in the last 8 months is that suddenly everyone started talking about AI, which was the result of foundation models such as ChatGPT. And when we think about AI and when we think about using AI in our daily lives and within our organizations, really, there are 3 types of emotions that we experience. Are we excited? Are we terrified? Or are we in the middle? Now, if we're terrified of using AI products or scaling AI products within our organizations, now the outcome is a commercial outcome, the commercial risk of not using something. If we're too excited about using AI systems, we may overlook some of the risks associated with it. So the best place to be in, which is the place that I'm in, is being somewhere in the middle. You will see from the stats I'm sharing on screen is that this focus on foundation models has sparked a lot of interest and a lot of investment in AI. So according to Gartner, at least 45% of the executive polls said that this laser focus on the likes of ChatGPT has prompted them to invest more in AI products. So as far as our agenda for today is concerned, first of all, we are going to talk about the basics, the definitions. What do we mean when we talk about AI? What do we mean when we talk about governance of AI systems? Then we are going to discuss, before I will kind of walk you through AI governance standards, I just need to, I guess, convince you that AI standards are emerging best practice. And with this in mind, we're going to briefly discuss what standards are, how they are made, and what the focus is in Europe and across the world on standards and standardization in general. Then we'll talk a little bit about the standard and what it's focused on, and our focus all of our attention on the key takeaways from the standard, on the key principles that the standard embraces in order to establish appropriate governance structures. I will draw on a few use cases so that it will be easier for you to visualize how AI governance can work within an organization. And then just to wrap it up, we'll focus on top tips to improve AI governance within your organization, again, drawing on the conversation on AI standard. Now, first things first, definitions. You may know, you may be aware that it is very tricky for companies, organizations, regulators across the world to define what artificial intelligence is. And today, when we are going to talk about artificial intelligence, we will use the definition used in the ISO standard, which is AI system is an engineered system that generates outputs, for example, content, forecast, recommendations, with respect to a given set of human-defined objectives. So the focus on engineered system, outputs, and human-defined objectives. This definition is not dissimilar to the definition adopted in the most recent version of the AI Act, which is also focused on machine-based system, on various outputs that the system can generate based on explicit and or implicit objectives. And as you can see, what is missing in this definition is this idea that it needs to be a human who sets the objectives. Our next point relates to AI governance, what it is. AI governance effectively takes into account who is making decisions for what, how risks are managed, what policies are in place, and how investment choices about AI are made. And in a nutshell, because AI governance is quite new to a lot of organizations, there is this intentional desire to see it as a separate process. In fact, it's best to view it as part of the overall governance process, which is part of the overall governance. And as you will see on this diagram that I'm sharing on screen, because AI is effectively executed via algorithms, and which is kind of software code, there is an overlap. Well, it needs to be seen as part of an IT governance. And given that AI systems are using data to produce outputs and for inputs as well, there is an overlap with data governance. So in summary, in a nutshell, AI governance is most successful if it extends existing governance structures and frameworks and adds additional AI-specific considerations. I won't dwell on it for too long, but AI technologies are different from other technologies. It draws on this principle of using data, on the system being adaptable, given that data may change over time, or the requirements for the outputs may change over time, and hence governance structures for AI systems will need to be fluid enough or adaptable enough to make sure that if the system changes or the output produced by the system changes over the life cycle of the product, then there are existing governance mechanisms to make sure that the system doesn't go rogue and that all the policies and systems are in check. Now let's consider what is happening across the world, and back to the point that I would like to bring home today. Standardization and standards are, as of now, emerging best practice, and you'll see that back in May, the leaders of G7 nations calls for the development of technical standards in order to develop a trustworthy AI. So it's clearly on many governments' agenda, and more specifically in the UK. As you know, there is no intention to legislate AI. The government published a white paper a few months back and focused on regulator-led approach. The government has also emphasized that technical standards are important to ensure compliance. And with this in mind, at some point last year, the government has established AI Standards Hub, which is an online hub that is tasked with promoting standards and educating the public on the standards. So what's happening in the EU? There is a lot of attention on the AI Act. What has less been talked about is how this act will be implemented. What happened in the background against all the noise around debates on the final wording of, well, interim wording of the AI Act. So what happened back in December 2022 is that the European Commission issued what is called draft standardization requests to European standardization bodies. The European Commission has asked to develop 10 standardization deliverables to support the implementation of the AI Act. Now, what will happen is that compliance with those standards is not mandatory, won't be mandatory, but there will be specific standards which compliance with those standards will assume compliance with the AI Act. And now the most recent version of the AI Act mentions standards and standardization around 50 times, to a point that there is a suggestion that there will be separate standards for foundation models. Very briefly, for you to understand what the standards are, how they are made, there are 4 types of standards: foundational standards, process standards, measurement standards, and performance standards. So foundational standards deal with definitions to make sure that the use of those is consistent across the board. Process standards address best practice. So this is where AI governance standard comes in, and a lot of other process-based standards. We won't talk about measurements, spend much time on measurement and performance standards, but these are important as well, not necessarily in the context of today's discussion, though. In terms of how standards are made, there are 3 layers of complexity, if you like. There are standards that are made by the International Standards Organization, ICO, ISO, and there are standards that are made by regional standardization bodies. For example, in Europe, that will be various European standardization organizations. There are quite a few. And there are also national bodies. In the UK, that will be British Standards Institution. So why do we need standards? And why do we need standards on AI? Broadly, at a very, very high level, they're required to make sure that high-level legislative obligations are clear and understood. So, for example, in the context of AI Act, it would have broad principles around transparency, for example, and there will be a standard supporting this high-level obligation. The more standards we have, the idea is that standards will improve trust and confidence, particularly in using AI systems and in AI products. And as a result, there will be better market adoption of technologies. Standards can be used by suppliers to ensure that to give confidence to their customers that what they're doing is right and consistent across across the board and consistent with what other suppliers are doing. Okay, the ICO standards. I'll throw a few numbers at you. There are 168 national standards bodies. and on average, it takes 3 to 5 years to publish a standard. And the reason it takes that long is because obviously you have stakeholders, multiple stakeholders from different countries, and all of them are working on the basis of principle of consensus. All of them need to agree what the final wording of each particular standard should be, and it takes time. In terms of standards on AI, you may or may not be surprised, but there are already 19 standards published on AI, specifically on relating to AI systems, and there are 28 standards under development. So there is a special committee that oversees the development of the standards. There are 36 participating members and 22 observing members. So the reason I'm throwing all those numbers at you is really to say it takes a long time to develop a standard. This process started some time ago, and because it started some time ago, now we have quite a few standards kind of ready to be used, and certainly an argument could be made that, you know, are those standards keeping pace with the technological development? And as far as AI governance standard is concerned, my response would be yes, because a standard AI governance standard is not focused on the technologies. It is focused on governance, on processes, and taking into account, you know, how broad the definition, you know, of AI is, and taking into account the processes that need to be in place in order to ensure that, you know, we achieve the right outcomes. Now let's get into the content of the standard. So I am drawing on the key principles. This is not how it's set out in the standard. It's just kind of my takeaway. My takeaways based on, you know, what I've seen, what I've read, and how I think it can be used by an organization. There are 6 building blocks for effective governance and effective AI governance. So the first building block is vision. The second is strategy, then governance oversight, risk and compliance, resources, staff, and skills. So the first building block is vision. In an ideal world, before any AI products or systems are being used by an organization, there needs to be a vision of what an organization wants to achieve by using those products. So that's top-down approach. It could be bottom-up, but at some point, it is important for the board to articulate what is it that they want to get out of using AI products now and in the future. Once the vision is in place, there needs to be a strategy to implement the vision. For both of those tasks, the board, the governing body, it's in the standards, they refer to the governing body of an organization, needs to have knowledge of the risks. So there is quite a substantive educational piece around what the AI systems do, what they don't, what the risks are. So once there is a vision in place and there is strategy in place on how to achieve vision in the next 3 to 5 years, then there needs to be separate consideration for an organization's risk appetite. Risk evolves over time. So, and as AI use develops, the risks will change. So as long as there is a way of measuring evolving and changing risks and making sure that use of AI systems does not compromise the existing risk appetite. You know, as long as this is done, at least you know, risks are being catered for. in order to ensure that risks are being addressed, there needs to be a risk management process, and I will touch upon it further on during the webinar. Now, when we talk about AI strategy, we should not forget about data strategy. And I quite like this quote by Sol Rashidi. She is a Chief Analytics Officer at Estée Lauder, and she's one of the top 9 influential women in AI. So she's saying, many have approached me about helping them develop an AI strategy. I say, of course, that will be my pleasure. But first, can I see your data strategy? So please don't forget the fundamentals to any AI strategy, AI project, AI program, or strategic initiatives. It always comes back to data. So, and it's a great visual that she shared as well. Data sorted, arranged, presented visually, explained with a story, and it is actionable. So AI strategy does not exist in isolation. AI strategy needs to link back and talk to data strategy. Next important block, building block number 3, governance oversight. So what does the standard say? The standard says the level of appropriate governance oversight depends on a number of factors. The type of AI used and the purpose of using it, the stage of implementation of the AI systems, risks and benefits, and also, the role played by an organization in the AI value chain, if it's a supply, if it's a customer. And broadly, when you start thinking through those issues, you encounter the first, you come across the first issue. So should you focus AI governance on the most critical areas, most pressing areas, or do you need to focus AI governance on everything? And I suppose the answer is it depends. And I think where the standard is going is that you set up the process, and then depending on the risks that you identify, the governance will follow. So as far as governance oversight is concerned, what we quite often asked, if we have, organizations ask us, okay, if we have an AI policy, will it be enough? If we have an AI ethics board, will it be enough? What are the things that we need to do to start the process? I think the process starts going back, vision, strategy, if you have one, and then implementation. So implementation goes back to the policies. What existing policies do we have that will need to be reviewed in order to ensure that the use of the products is appropriate? And that, according to the standard, that goes back to the 3 critical areas: governance over decision making, effectively using AI systems to produce a decision; governance of data use, to the extent that AI systems, discussed it just 5 minutes ago, that to the extent that AI systems are using data, then there is an overlap with governance of data use. And the third area is culture and values of an organization. To the extent that AI products are being used, is this in line with culture of an organization? Is this in line with the values? So these are broadly the 3 areas that I will discuss in a little bit more detail. At a high level, once you examine your existing policies, the next question would be, what other policies do we need to have in order to support the use of this technology? Who do we need to engage with? What stakeholders are affected by the use, by our use of AI systems? And do we have sufficient human oversight for when we use the systems. So these are all broad areas that you will need to think through and consider for when you are starting this process of mapping governance relating to AI. So governance of decision making. It is important to know that if you use AI systems to help you with the decision making, if it's used by the board, if it's used by the management, then it needs to follow your existing governance procedures. The level of decision making needs to match the authority granted. You'd need to ensure that the system, the AI system, is actually capable to make the decision. Obviously, with foundation models, this is almost a non-issue now. But there are a few critical questions that you need to ask yourself along the way as to if we use, say, ChatGPT to make a decision, what processes internally do we need to go through in order to make sure that the decision is right and the decision is appropriate. So this is where the point around transparency of decision-making process becomes very important. And this is something that the standards puts a huge emphasis on. Governance of data use. So that's another area where you would need to look into your existing policies in relation to how in relation to procurement, in relation to privacy, security, retention and disposal of data, and how training data is being used to train the system, who provides this data, what output is being produced. So these are all important considerations that ideally there are already existing processes in place within the organization to make sure that data is used appropriately. So what needs to be done is to consider to what extent use of AI systems will have an impact on this process. And I'm just kind of sharing a list on screen of additional considerations for when AI is being used, how data is collected, how data is prepared, how assumptions are formulated in relation to data that is being used, for example, to train an AI system. Someone needs to examine whether there are any biases and whether there are any gaps or shortcomings in the data that is being used. Quite like this example of how DBS is addressing issues relating to governance of data. So DBS has been known for quite a few years as an organization that uses AI at scale for many projects. And what they've done, they created a responsible data use committee. They examine whether customer-facing data is appropriate to collect and to use. And what I like about their approach is that not only they're looking into legal considerations, they're also considering to what extent it would be, such use of data would be acceptable. So they're using this principle called PURE. Data collected must be purposeful, it must be unsurprising, it must be respectful, and it must be explainable. So they have a separate committee that is looking into those issues. Risk and compliance is another very important area that needs to be looked into. As far as compliance obligations are concerned, there are a few points there are a few points that the standard refers to, that the governing body of the board of directors needs to consider as far as their compliance obligations are concerned. They need to consider risk appetite. They need to consider policies, existing compliant policies that are in place. They need to consider what stakeholders expect those stakeholders that are impacted by the use of AI systems. What do they expect? What the cultural implications are, and by the cultural implications, the standards refers to an example of when AI systems are being used within an organization. There is almost an assumption, there could be an assumption by some employees that what the system produces is error-free. And we've seen it in the news in the last few months that actually, as far as foundation models are concerned, you cannot rely on the output being the source of truth. You need to make sure that you verify and ensure that the outcome, the output is the right output. Risk management. So we discussed that as part of the strategy, setting the strategy, there is also risk appetite that exists that allows an organization to check whether what is being done, what has been proposed is in line with risk appetite. AI governance standards refers back to another standards that is specifically on risk management of AI. And this standard was published fairly recently as well. So this standard talks about, it refers to the need to review pre-existing policies and procedures, something that we'll kind of discussed when we talked about governance oversight. It suggests that new policies and procedures will need to be addressed, and it's fairly comprehensive, and it's sort of designed to work hand in hand with the AI governance standards. So just kind of giving you an example of some of the points that the risk management standard talks about. When you assess particular risks, you need to gather information and understand to what extent your proposed course of action may have an impact on what risk it will entail. And the suggestion from the risk management standard is to look at the external factors and internal factors. So external factors, what are the political implications of doing of using the product? What are the stakeholders' perception of using AI systems? What are the technological trends and advancements? There are also internal factors. What impact use of AI will have on culture of an organization, for example. So we talked about vision, we talked about strategy, we talked about governance oversight and risk and compliance. So another important building block of successful AI governance is related to people that support the implementation of various policies and procedures. And as far as the AI governance standard is concerned, the point that is made in the standard is that it is the governing body of an organization that is responsible for defining what the values of an organization are and what the culture of an organization is. And to the extent AI systems are being used, there needs to be a process in place to ensure that culture and values are not compromised. And the standard argues that, in some instances, you may actually consider setting culture and values board or an ethics review board. And we, as lawyers, we are also asked whether, having just an ethics board is enough, or do organizations need to have a separate AI officer? And it's an interesting question. Are we going to have an AI officer in the same way as we have a data protection officer? And so far, there are a few examples of those roles created within organizations. They may be called AI officer, they may be called chief analytics officer, but they will be people that are responsible for driving AI agenda or implementing AI strategy. And then very interesting question was posed in the recent report by Deloitte. They were trying to answer a question as to whether you need one AI officer that is responsible for ethics, or do you need to have a separate ethics board? And the conclusion that they're making is that actually it's so complex. Ethical issues are complex. You can't leave one person to deal with all those issues. So they say, in terms of skills, they say you need to be business savvy. You need to have communication skills. You need to have industry knowledge. You need to have regulatory knowledge. You need to have technical knowledge. It's very difficult to find someone who can do all of that. Not impossible, but very difficult. And as I said, what we're seeing is that there are AI officers of the like responsible for driving AI strategy, less so ethics. And just to show you a few examples, back in, I think it was 2019, Levi was one of the first companies that created Chief Strategy and Artificial Intelligence Officer, Kathy Walsh. She left Levi fairly recently to join, I think, Harvard University. But there was a lot of buzz on the market when this role was created. So she was tasked with setting the company's corporate strategy, digital strategy. H&M is another example, head of responsible AI and data. Her name is Linda Leopold. She's also responsible for driving AI-related decisions and strategy. In terms of what other companies are doing, we'll have most of technology companies that are actually willing to make sure that the market trusts that what they're doing is right. Most of those companies have created specific AI ethics boards, and the members of this board could be internal members, external, and they're tasked with making sure that the products that are being developed are appropriate products. Now let's park AI governance standard for a moment. I just wanted to walk you through an example, a practical example of how one organization created AI governance framework, and this organization is Unilever. Unilever, back in 2022, Unilever developed AI assurance policies. And it was important for the global data science director. It was important to ensure that not only they have policies, but they have a way of implementing those policies and upholding those policies. And with this in mind, they created a process of ensuring that whenever a new AI application is being sourced, there is quite a few hoops to jump before this product can be actually used within an organization. So what happens is that if there is a proposal to use an AI product, Unilever employee or supplier needs to propose a use case and explain why particular product needs to be used. This case is being reviewed internally. Depending on the complexity, it may be outsourced to be reviewed internally. Then whoever proposed the use case will be informed of the outcomes. So it may be that at that point in time, if any risks are identified, then some sort of mitigation will be proposed. After application is being developed, it will be either, again, internally or an external provider will run tests to make sure that there are no issues with fairness, there are no issues with bias, and that generally applicable laws are being complied with. So then at that point, the decision needs to be made whether, if there are any risks identified at that point, whether a risk can be mitigated or whether it cannot be mitigated. So, and this is, I find what is important in this process. If there is a risk that cannot be mitigated, a particular application has been rejected because it doesn't meet the requirements of the policy. So there is no, I guess, argument against it. It's been for and against. It's been rejected. And final decision on use cases are made by a committee. It's a senior executive board. It consists from various representatives from the business, from human resources, from legal. They're all making the decision as to whether or not a particular AI application should be used. And clearly, there will be, different AI applications will determine different focus. What I can't tell you is to what extent, whether they examine all the use cases, or whether at some point there is a risk-based approach that is at the very beginning that is being adopted in order to ensure that they are not overloaded with too many cases. So that's the process. Throughout this process, there are a few opportunities to fix issues if they arise. And what is important in this process is that a decision made, final decision made by, by not just one person, but quite a few people, a committee. Now, what I've done, I've tried to compare this use case against an example in one of ISO standards, not AI governance standard, but there is another standard dealing with ethical concerns surrounding the use of AI products. So what the standard suggests is that first, you define principles, you define your policies, and around the sourcing of AI products. You create a review body that will need to review use cases against your policies, and you create procedures for flagging projects to the review body, and to make sure that once new cases come in, they are made aware of those use cases and they examine and review them. So there are a whole lot of protocols and policies that need to be created in order to support this process. In order to make this happen, there needs to be obviously a team. Team needs to be trained to be able to make decisions, to make assessments on risks, and to propose outcomes. The standard also suggests that there needs to be follow-up around initial proposition, mitigation, and whether those mitigations were properly addressed. And the standard then suggests that you need to monitor. And actually, that's an important point to make in the context of AI governance framework, is that this framework needs to be robust enough to ensure that the product, a particular product, depending on the risk profile, is monitored across the entire life cycle. So it's not just, figuring out whether it's appropriate or not in the beginning. It's just making sure that, at implementation stage, in integration, decommissioning stage, someone thinks through issues and someone thinks through particular concerns that may arise. Okay, and the final building block, skills. a lot to be said that in order to build appropriate governance frameworks, you actually need to have a buy-in from your employees. People tend to be more receptive to change if they know what this change means. And a lot of organizations solve this problem differently. It could be like an external partnering with an external provider to learn the basics of AI. It could be, for example, creating internal hackathons to develop AI products, just to make sure that people are talking about AI and that they're not afraid that the AI will come and replace them, and that they're excited about kind of this change. Included a few examples on screen on how, for example, DBS using training their employees, so how they're creating what they call translators, group of people who are not necessarily IT specialists, who are not necessarily from the business, but people who have the skills to translate what the business wants and how the IT team can meet those needs. So we talked about, just to remind you, we talked about 6 building blocks of effective AI governance based on the AI governance standards: vision, strategy, governance oversight, risk and compliance, skills, and resources. Now let's go back to what we've discussed and focus on what I call top 10 tips on how to improve AI governance. So first things first, educate and train. Very important. Things will be so much easier if people who need to use the systems, or people who will be impacted by the AI systems, if they know what they're dealing with. Second, obvious point, stay compliant. It could be tricky in the countries in the UK where we are not going to have a specific legislation, but we are surely going to have lots of guidance from the regulators as to how to stay compliant. This is where standards as well come in, that provide useful framework for ensuring you have the right processes in place to get to the outcome that you want. Number 3, establish appropriate governance oversight, which means review your existing policies, think what new other policies you'll need to implement, for example, AI policies. Make sure you review those policies and procedures regularly, and align the use of AI to your organization's culture and values. Make sure that you have the likes of AI ethics board or some group that will look into those issues, think about those issues, group of people that talk with each other to make sure that the use of AI systems is appropriate and doesn't create any fairness, bias, and other issues. Tip number 6, consider your risk appetite, adopt a risk-based approach. Number 7, and this is something that was drawing on the Unilever use case, think of examples of AI systems that you will never use. And in that respect, perhaps we, obviously in the UK, we will be impacted by the AI Act. Think of, based on what is defined as high-risk systems and how it is applicable to your organization, think of systems you will never use, and you will embed it in your policies that you will not use those systems. The next tip is start documenting what you do and what you procure and how you decide on whether to use or not a particular system. It will be important, in some ways it will be important for the purposes of AI Act compliance if you are impacted by it, but generally start creating this awareness and this knowledge that will help you making decisions about AI systems, AI products going forward. Always think about those people that are impacted by the use of AI systems. And the final final tip is what I call low stakes practice. It really depends on where your organization is with your AI journey, but there is a lot to be said about starting practicing early and developing mechanisms in place and trialing, engaging with stakeholders across your organizations on small issues, on small use cases. Start doing it early, because when you're ready to scale, you have a process in place that you can implement almost with no issues, hopefully with no issues going forward. So these are top 10 tips, and I'm wrapping up the presentation. I'm seeing that we probably need some time to answer questions, but feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to know more about standards and standardization. Sam and I have written a lot of articles about it, so just Google my name. And finally, just to mention a few AI products that I used in order to prepare for this presentation, because I think we're getting to a point when we need to be able to ensure that we use those products on a daily basis so that it becomes second nature. So I use a product called Otter AI. It's speech to text in order to kind of think through what I'm going to say today. I'm used a product called Beautiful AI to generate those slides, and I use another AI system to generate some of those pictures. I'll stop here. I'll pause. I think it's time for questions. Thank you very much, and ready to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this inspiring presentation. There have been many questions on the chat. I will just, given that the time is limited, I will just pick some of those and promise that we will come back for the rest after the meeting. So
Panajota, there's two questions which are fairly straightforward. One person asked whether the slides will be available. Yes, they will. And another person asked, will the recording be available? Yes, they will. So there's two done. So Panajota and Barbara, you could deal with the rest.
Thank you very much, Sam. There have been a series of questions. I will pick one from Stephen. Stephen Castell. Stephen asks, I may have missed this being covered at the start. Have the AI governance standards referred to been formally adopted into UK law? If so, when, where are they mandatory or merely advisory guidance?
Yeah.
I don't know, Stephen, if you wish to state yourself this question. Of our committee members.
Thank you, Stephen, for your question. AI, standards are not mandatory, so compliance is with the standards is voluntary. If we take an example of ISO standards on data quality or ISO standards security standards, you may choose to comply, and you may choose to get certification that you comply, and you will give assurance to your customers that what as I said, what you do is right, but you don't have to do it. So it won't be kind of adopted as a law. These standards kind of sit outside of specific legislative requirements. It's just something for organizations to use if they want to be able to leverage international wisdom, if you like, on this in this area.
Okay, another question. The user has said his or her name. What role will lawyers play as AI becomes frequently used by big corporations? What problems do you think will arise, and how will lawyers adopt their role in the cyber industry effectively?
So the question is how lawyers will adapt to using AI.
Yes, in an effective way. And as it's being used by big corporations, not practiced by individual users, what problems could arise?
Well, I guess there is always a concern: are we lawyers are going to get out of jobs? My personal view is any lawyer right now needs to be a technology lawyer, and AI skill needs to be needs to be a skill that all of us, including lawyers, need to be able to embrace on a day-to-day basis. So those systems are here to stay. So we need to learn how to use them. If anything, if you practice, chatting to ChatGPT on a daily basis, it saves you time. But this process will take time. It will take time for lawyers, accountants to realize how to benefit from the system and to ensure that confidential information is not being shared, that personal information is not being shared, that all those risks are addressed. It will address properly. It will take time, but it's certainly something that I encourage even my children to think about and start using it now as opposed to tomorrow.
Okay, I think our time is limited. I'll choose another question in regards to shadow AI. It has been the case that AI is used also outside of an organizational context. I will just phrase it as the speaker does. I think another big risk in this area is that even with strategy and policy in place, control of shadow use of AI is a pressing concern. So where AI tools are used outside of the organization's perimeter to generate products that end up being used within the organization, so it cannot be managed effectively. So he shares a concern about shadow AI not being in an organizational context, but being used outside it and then brought inside an organization. If you have some thoughts on this, Barbara.
Yeah. So this is certainly a risk, and I guess this question is geared towards use of foundation models and ChatGPT and the likes. What we've seen organizations have been doing on the market is there are organizations that prohibit use of ChatGPT. What it means is that it doesn't mean that your employees will stop necessarily using it. You may have all policies and procedures in place, but indeed someone may just use it outside of work, generate a product that will be used during work. So these are considerations that it's very difficult to address those because things like that will happen. And in my view, it still goes back to the question of training and educating your employees and the policies that will suggest that if you are going to use ChatGPT, use it for initial ideas, for initial iteration of ideas. Do not use it for actual creation of, marketing material, because these are the outcomes. This is the confidentiality outcome. This is an IP outcome. These are the things that an organization will be dealing with if you do that. So it goes back to educating employees, but certainly it could be an issue for any organization that it needs to address.
At this point, I would like to state that we have reached our time. It has been wonderful having Barbara with us and having this inspiring presentation. I would like to welcome you to stay tuned and join the next Law Specialist Group event, and also to pass the goodbye from our chair, Sandra Silva. Thank you very much, and we look forward to having you in one of our next webinars. And thank you very much, Barbara.
Thanks, Panajota. Yeah, just to echo those thoughts of Panajota and the rest of the BCS Law SG. Thanks, Barbara. I appreciate you being busy. So thank you for taking the time. That was very enlightening, and you covered a lot. So thank you for that. And as I said, we keep watch. We're going to take a bit of a break for summer holidays, but stay tuned for webinars sort of in the rest of the year. And if any of you have got any ideas of webinars you would like to present, or any presentations you would like us to sort of source and secure, let us know and we will try to do that. So everybody have a good evening, have a good summer, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.